And I'm really grateful that you guys chose the book because, there's a lot of different things you look for as an author, but when an entire community decides to read your book, it's just a huge thrill. And also, a few weeks ago, I was on the road and I got an email from Catherine Thorne, whom I'd also like to thank for this night. And she said, the season switched rather quickly. It was summer a few weeks ago, and she said, we've even arranged a forest fire for you. There's one burning in the Olympic Peninsula right now. So thank you for starting that fire as well. It's very nice. We have a fabulous reputation in the Northwest, a deserving one, as the most literate part of the United States. And part of the reasons is nights like this. A community decides to dive into a book for a year, and then you bring the authors. So that's one of the things that keeps this wonderful tradition alive. Also, I was really concerned with my last two books because I chose really somewhat obscure, and elemental topics. I wrote about dust, and then I wrote about fire. And people say, you're just working your way through like the major elements. And I think, people ask me what my themes are, and I don't consciously set out to write about themes, but I keep thinking of this fabulous t-shirt I saw after the 1989 Bay Area earthquake. I was down there covering it for the New York Times. It was the World Series earthquake because the Giants of San Francisco were playing the Oakland A's, and I think it was game 2. There's this earthquake, stops the series and flattens Highway 880, and luckily it wasn't too bad on casualties. But the next day I saw t-shirts all over town that said, "Nature bats last." And that's really, I guess I've thought about it, that's the theme of my books, is that nature bats last. That we go through these episodes of hubris. We go through these episodes where we think we're technologically superior. We go through these episodes where we don't have bad things happen. And so then nature comes along and sort of answers the question, not to anthropomorphize nature too much, but it does do that. Also, I've always been, as a college student actually, I was introduced to the writings of Wallace Stegner, and I think Angle of Repose is a pitch-perfect novel. Did you read that, Alfie? You were into the avant-garde things, edgy sort of stuff. It's beautiful, it's pitch perfect, it's just a gorgeous novel. But Stegner was also a writer of the West and a writer of what we're trying to do in the West. What's our mission out here? And one of his many terrific lines was that the challenge of Western city builders is to build a civilization to match the setting. And so that's a theme I'm also interested in exploring in all my books. What's the civilization like? How does it match the setting? And one more thing, and I realize this, I came to this somewhat late, but it's probably because of my background. People look at history and they write these, it sounds like a sexist term, but they call it great men histories. Great men come along, great men build railroads, great men build bridges, great men build skyscrapers, and history is told from the point of view of those great men and women, but it's called the great men theory. I'm more interested in the people at the margins, the people who are so-called average folks living through the great event. So in both this fire book, I do play with these wonderful historical figures because they're so fabulous. Roosevelt and Pinchon, we get to them tonight. They're just extraordinary figures, and they affect our lives every day in the Pacific Northwest. But I'm really interested also in those people who were along for the ride of history. They were there when something happened, and what are their stories? And I fear in the future we won't have those stories because I am an excavator of diaries. And I'm an excavator of letters and personal stories. And I like to write novelistically. In order to recreate a time, a place, a character, a drama, an event, I need those letters, I need those diaries. And I'm sorry, dude, see you at 6 on a text message. It's probably not going to be enough for future writers like myself. Now, a word or two about telling these stories. I'm not, by any stretch of the imagination, a trained historian. I'm not an academic. I grew up with a love of history and a love of books and a love of the outdoors. And I got into journalism because I wanted a ticket to the world. I didn't have wealth in my family. I didn't have connections. I came from a large Irish Catholic family. And journalism was suddenly this transport. It gave me a reason to jump into other people's lives and to get you know, famous and powerful people to return my phone calls under threat of saying something nasty about them. So I was allowed into all these people's private worlds, into all these big events, starting with when Mount St. Helens blew, and an editor told me to get on a helicopter right away, and I was flying over and going, "This is so cool!" Looking down at this sea of downed trees, etc. So it really changed. It really allowed me to jump, you know, into experiences that I wouldn't otherwise have. Now, I wrote my first book, The Good Ring, which Theo was kind to mention, because I felt that we'd been we'd been shortchanged here in the Northwest, that our history was railroad man, Sam Hill builds railroad, dams are built on the Columbia, skyscrapers go up, cities, hills are leveled, and Boeing comes along, and that's our history. And I thought there's so much more there. There was so much that was not told in this traditional history of the Northwest. So I wrote that book out of looking for a different point of view. And my take was to write it from the point of view of the land, to see how the land shapes people. And that was my jumping off point for The Good Ring. And it happened, really, if I'm a historian at all, I'm an accidental historian. And what got me into this was a complete accident as well. I'm lucky I've got two of my relatives here tonight, and they know this story, but when my wonderful grandmother died, actually when my grandfather died before that, she gave me his ashes. And she said, you know, I want you to bury him, do something with him. And I said, where? Don't do him. She goes, I don't care what you do, just throw him off the ferry if you want. Just do something appropriate. So they sort of sat in my house in Seattle for a while and stared at this urn for a long time, feeling my belated Catholic guilt build up with every day as I walked by and said, hi, Grandpa. And finally, I had seized upon an idea, because he was a fisherman, to throw the ashes in the headwaters of the Green River on Mount Rainier, on this glacier on Rainier. I thought it would be perfect. So I hiked up to the Burroughs Mountain, which is a side mountain of Rainier, on a lovely fall day with a vine maple aflame, and hiked up to about 7,500 feet and took those ashes out and threw them on this glacier and walked away feeling that I was fulfilled and my guilt cloud had been lifted. And then I went back and I got curious about where I'd dumped these ashes. It was a place called the Winthrop Glacier, according to the map. So I just went to this library and looked up this place names of Washington. You know, Winthrop Glacier, named for Theodore Winthrop, wrote first book on Northwest. I'd never heard of this guy. It turned out he'd come out here a son of privilege, a son of this great Winthrop family from New England, you know, the city on the hill, that phrase that's often uttered, and Reagan used to use it as well. He came out here just wanting to flee his family, just get rid of his baggage. He came out here in the 1850s and was just enthralled by the Pacific Northwest. The Pacific Northwest in its birthday suit. You know, hardly anybody living here. Unfortunately, natives in decline from diseases, but no cities. And he wrote this book called The Canoe and the Saddle, where he just went all over the Northwest by canoe and saddle. And then the Civil War came, and he was the first American officer killed in the Civil War. His book is then published. It's a huge bestseller. It sells a zillion copies. Then it goes into obscurity. So when I wrote The Good Ring, I was basically following his tracks of the canoe and the saddle. And it was all because I threw my grandfather's ashes on this Winthrop Lake and got curious about, you know, Winthrop and this person. So that gave me my reason to follow this person. And that book just changed my life. It made me realize that regions, like families and like nations, and like good soccer teams, need mythology, need story, need narrative. And one of the things we lack in the West is story and narrative, and at least deep story. We all bring our little stories. We don't have a sustaining story. I love this line attributed to the Sioux Indians, which goes like this: "A people without history are like wind on the buffalo grass." And that sort of describes so much of our, you know, word wind on the buffalo grass. This thing is just blowing across. So, a few years ago, I went for the first time to Ireland. Took the Egan clan from my 80-year-old mother to nieces and nephews in their teenage years to Ireland. And we went to County Clare, where some of us are from, one part of the family. And there are only two functioning businesses in this town in County Clare. There was a Egan's pub. And across, I'm not exaggerating, across the street there was a Egan's Wine and Books. I figured we had it covered. That night I'm in the pub with my family and we're having a wonderful time being connected to our fellow Egans, and everyone's buying us shots of Powers and Jamesons, not Bushmills, that's from the north. And we're singing and dancing, and people start with the old traditional music. We're just having a marvelous time, and my younger brother Danny turns to me and he goes, "You know, I finally feel at home." I said, "Why?" He goes, "I'm in a nation of lyrical alcoholics." I said, yeah, it sounds like us. A few years ago, I started with the Dust Bowl book, and that was so utterly foreign to me because I'm a third-generation Northwestern. Suddenly I'm transported to this part of the country I had no idea about, and I feel like, I keep thinking I was like one of these British expeditioners from the 19th century who goes to the Congo and says, "Where can a chap get a gin and tonic?" And I just felt like I was so out of place. There was no shade, no mountains, there were no rivers, there was no blue or green. There was the wind, the constant presence of the wind. And, you know, they were pulling my leg, but some farmer told me, I asked about this wind. I mean, a low wind was 30 miles an hour. And that was like, and I said, what's with this wind? And this guy told me, you know, if it ever stopped blowing, all the chickens would fall down. It's a way to keep the chickens up. And I was so lucky. It has a special magic, the Great Plains. It took a while for it to get into my soul, for me to see it. Moments at sunset, moments when you look up in the sky and see birds going by. Moments when you just sort of reveled in the loneliness of it all, this infinity of flat, this vast open space, and the emptiness. And I can understand these diary entries that I later read of women especially writing these things about being so lonely, about being alone on this homestead, and the emptiness of the prairie was killing them. But I also felt very quickly then I had this, once I realized what the story was that I was going to tell, that I had this responsibility. I was talking to people who would be gone from this earth in a few years, and 5 of my characters I follow in the Dust Bowl book have since died. They were wonderful people in their late 80s and early 90s, and they told just fabulous stories. And as I looked into their eyes and listened to them talk about this long ago, distant era when we had no Social Security, when we had, people would eat roadkill, and they would build these little houses they called dugouts. Half of the house was underground, the other half was above, and they had newspapers lining the inside for insulation. And there would be nine people in a dugout of about 400 square feet. And the stories they told were so remarkable. And this one old timer said, I heard this quite a bit about when a storm would approach. At midday, it would be like a sunny day. Suddenly it would go just totally dark. And one guy told me it was like 2 midnights in a jug. That's what happened at noon when one of these dust storms would come. But I heard these wonderful stories, and I felt this responsibility to pass it on. I kept thinking of this image of a baton. I was being handed this baton, this storyteller's baton from a living generation. Someone still alive. You could look into their eyes and say, tell me what it was like. You were a little girl when you were 17 years old, and the world was yours. And suddenly the world changed dramatically. Worst depression, worst environmental disaster. People dying of dust pneumonia before you. A kid sitting next to you in class one day, next day he's gone. It's an amazing story. And when I was in the middle of this book, actually after I'd finished it, I felt I'd written a strong book. I felt I'd written something that was honest. You know, Hemingway used to always try to write honestly and authentically, try to tell a good and true story. But I really didn't think anyone was going to want to read it, because like those old ladies, they'd stop telling their stories because they didn't think anyone would believe it. So my son came home from high school, and he had his AP history book, big fat, history of America, and I went back to the index and looked up Dust Bowl, and it was one paragraph. And I said, oh God, I just really chosen this obscure thing. So, I mean, what we know from the Dust Bowl, we know from Steinbeck, because Steinbeck told a take of the Dust Bowl, and that was the people who left, the people who fled, the diaspora. And 1 million people did leave. It was the largest out-migration in United States history because of a weather event until Hurricane Katrina. So we lost 1 million people. But 2 million, 2/3 of them, didn't go anywhere. So my basis was the question that hadn't been asked. What was it like to stay behind? What was it like to live through this? Steinbeck's was, what was it like to flee? So, you know, after his first chapter, you're out of the Dust Bowl. You're in California. You realize, you know, what it's like to be that. So that's the story I tried to tell. And now I've been working with Ken Burns, and it'll be his documentary in the fall of 2012. So if you saw Prohibition, which I thought was terrific, especially the Scandinavian bootleggers of Seattle, which very orderly. They didn't in those homesteads. They didn't even carry guns, but you know, cops were all on the take, and all worked. Everything worked really well. Went to bed early, but they all got their booze from top to finish. Anyway, I've seen the rough cut. It's 4 hours. It's beautiful. It's really gorgeous. And the thing that happened in that book, I found a wide readership. I was really happy. I won a National Book Award. But what I really love is that one of the women I fell in love with, this 88-year-old woman who's the daughter of a Broadway dancer, whose mother leaves New York. She's told, you got to get out of New York. The air is killing you. So she goes to Kansas, and her daughter ends up getting dust pneumonia. But she called me up after the book came out, and she said little kids were showing up on her doorstep wanting to do their 6th grade project on her, and a Rotary Club of this county, which had never paid any attention to her, wanted her to speak. And she said, Tim, you've made me like a rock star in this town. And she died like 6 months later, and I was so happy because her story got told. Her story got told. That's what we really want, is we want our story to be told. And they had, it's like World War II vets in that sense. Something like 20 World War II vets die every day. Remember, most of them are in their 80s now, and mid-80s. And with them go these living links. The thing I have with the Dust Bowl. If those of you who have parents and grandparents that age, talk to them, get your story, make sure your kids have it, write it down, get it there. It's so important we have these stories. Now, with The Big Burn, which I hope none of you were forced to read, see the students in the audience, I don't know if you were forced to read it. I had a difficult problem because no one was alive. This fire is 101 years old. Last year was the 100th anniversary. So everyone's dead. It happened 2 years before the sinking of the Titanic, and we just lost the last survivor of the Titanic, someone who had been 3 or 4 years old. So there's no one there, and I couldn't look into someone's eyes and say, tell me what it was like to be a little girl, or tell me what your hopes were like, or I couldn't read diaries and then check it with the person. I had to go on the written record. But as I started to think about this fire story, I started to think of the bigger story, the bigger history of America, the fact that we have public land, and why that makes us so different from other, not just democracies, but other countries. And I had a couple of holy cow moments where I looked around and I said, you have national parks, and national forests, and national wildlife refuges, and Bureau of Land Management. And we have an area about the size of Germany that everyone in this audience, provided you're American, owns. That it's your right as an American citizen. It's on your birth certificate. You shall have co-title to this area the size of Germany. And I sort of reading Jefferson, as he was envisioning in the founding days, thought it was important that the public square, that everybody have a stake in public land. It didn't really come about till later. Of course, he did the Louisiana Purchase. But this fire, I then saw the connection to our public land legacy. And I'll try to explain that a little bit. Also, I really love the themes floating through this time in history. It was, again, 101 years ago, but so many themes similar to today's day. The gap between rich and poor had never been bigger. There were these robber barons, copper barons, lumber barons, who had great wealth and were ostentatious about it, building these huge mansions. And then there was everyone else. So this gap had never been eclipsed until the last 10 years, when we eclipsed it. Well, we rivaled it again. So you have that parallel. We had the biggest surge in immigration in our history. People think now, all these Latinos are. It's not close to what it was. We had a huge surge in immigration, largely Southern European. It had been a little easier when they let the Northern Europeans in, but when they let Italians, Greeks, Serbs, Croats, people started to say, oh, these dark-skinned people, these short people, there were all these really awful things said about them by so-called educated people, terrible things about them. And these were some of the heroes of this wildfire. These were some of the people who died for this event. And then you have, of course, the fire itself. It was it's a spectacular physical event. Now, Texas has been on fire for about 6 months. Rick Perry ordered prayer in April. 2 days of a formal prayer to end the fire. Unfortunately, they didn't have their worst drought ever, which I think God was mad at Rick Perry. We're just trying to send a message. I go to call him saying, please don't pray for anything else. he had a prayer event for the economy shortly thereafter. On the Monday after the prayer event, the market crashed 490 points. He has the reverse effect on prayer. So Texas has been burning all year, basically since March. It's finally getting some rain this last 2 days, some tropical storms. It's been burning all spring, all summer, nonstop. And in all that time, even allowing for Texas exaggeration, about 3 million acres is burned in the 6 months. Okay, in the Big Burn, 3 million acres burned in a weekend. In 36 hours, actually, not even a weekend. An area the size of Connecticut went poof, like that. And so we've never had a wildfire in our recorded history that was just of that magnitude. So, I mean, it has sort of an astonishing claim just on the size of it and the ferocity of it. Now, about 100 people died in that fire, which is lucky considering there were 10,000 people assembled to fight it. The blowdown was like Mount St. Helens. Remember all the trees that were knocked down after Helens? That was from the pyroclastic flow and the force of that thing. Most of the trees that were knocked down in the Big Burn were from the explosion and the weather event itself that was created by the fire. They weren't because they were burned, but the force of the wind itself. There was enough timber to build a city the size of Chicago that was knocked down in that fire. There were hurricane force winds, which are described as 70 miles an hour or more. I was in a recreation for a History Channel documentary a few years ago, and they asked me, I performed the knucklehead role. They went and got these 2 giant vans, put them on a flatbed truck, and wanted to create a 70-mile-an-hour wind to see what it was like. And I'm, yeah, I'll sit in front of it. And just rolled like a tumbleweed, and they laughed. They got it all filmed before we got but there was a doctor on site because it was a union production. So now, the other thing that happened was we had never tried to fight a wildfire before. Our cities had been burned. Chicago burned. San Francisco burned after the earthquake. Seattle burned. Spokane burned. Denver burned. All these towns built of wood burned. But we had never tried to fight a wildfire. And they thought, well, there were all these little fires burning in August in the panhandle of Idaho. And they thought, but this is before the blow-up. And they thought, my God, it'll threaten the towns. They thought it may get to Spokane. It may get to Denver. So they assembled this army of 10,000 people. And these were mostly immigrants. These were these Irish, Italian, Serbs, etc. that I mentioned. One of the magazines, Collier's, which was the popular magazine of the day, said there were Scotsmen and Negroes, Italians and Danes, Micks, Macs, and Scandinavians. That's who fought that fire. Now, they were assembled together under this remarkable group of people, the first United States Forest Rangers. They were called Little GPs after GP Gifford Pinchot. And these people thought that they were on a sacred mission. They called it the Great Cause. They were chosen by Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, almost like knights being tapped on the head, to be the forest rangers, to be in charge of this thing, conservation, which is a term that Pinchot claims he invented while on horseback riding in Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C., and then took back to Roosevelt and explained it to him. Now, I don't quite buy it because there were other people, John Muir, writing at the time about similar thoughts, but maybe Pinchot was the first person to take it to the presidential bully pulpit, and that's what made it a popular term. But anyway, he says he created it. Now, I mentioned, I don't try to write from the great men or women perspective, but there's a huge asterisk for Teddy Roosevelt. Like a lot of people who came to this Mount Rushmore figure, I absolutely fell for the guy. He's an extraordinary figure. He wrote 40 books before his 40th birthday. He would dash off 10 letters, a review for the Audubon Journal, a 6-mile hike, and sign a treaty and then meet with 10 senators and do this before lunch. He used to go skinny dipping in the Potomac with Pinchot, who was his top aide. So, you know, imagine George Bush II and Karl Rove naked. Just deciding policy while skinny dipping, right? And, or, you know, Barack Obama and Rahm Emanuel for that matter. So one time, there's a great incident, they loved it. Roosevelt wrote about this in his autobiography, that he was skinny dipping with Pinchot. They used to do this late into the fall, in November, whatever. Secret Service would be holding their clothes, and they'd be freezing, but Roosevelt, I love this. They'd be swimming naked in the Potomac, and the French ambassador was with him. He had gone on this hike with Roosevelt. And they asked him to jump in, and so he took all his clothes off, the French ambassador, except for his gloves. And he jumped into the Potomac, and Roosevelt asked him, why are you wearing gloves? And he said, there might be ladies present. This was this remarkable figure. He was a polymath. He was the son of privilege. His father died when he was still in college and left him an inheritance. He could have just been a snot-nosed rich kid who kicked around in the clubs of the day. Instead, he dedicated his life to so many things, and one of the things was conservation. And how he came to that was remarkable. Roosevelt was an aspiring politician. He was a Republican and a reformer, and he was on his way to being the head of the Republicans in the New York Assembly before his 25th birthday. He lived across the street from Central Park, New York City, on, I think it's West 57th, if that's the cross street there. You lived in New York, isn't that right? West 57th, thank you. And he had a house there, a little 2-story townhouse, and his mother lived upstairs, and his beautiful wife lived downstairs with him. He was madly in love with this woman he had met at Harvard. And she gave birth to their first child, Alice, on Valentine's Day, 1884, I think it was, February 14th. And she, the mother, the love of his life, died in childbirth, as often happened in those days with complications. And Roosevelt is just destroyed, this 25-year-old man. His love of his life, he used to write these poems to her. He said, sometimes I feel like I'm on fire, I'm so in love with you, in some of these letters. She dies. He goes upstairs, and on the same day, his mother dies. She had been sick with something, but she took a sudden turn for the worse. So he loses his wife and his mother on the same day. And one of the great thrills for me as a storyteller was reading all of Roosevelt's diary entries in the Library of Congress. They make you put on gloves, just like the French ambassador. And so I'm turning the pages, looking at Roosevelt's diary. On February 14th, the day this tragedy happens, there's a giant X on the page. And this is a prolific diarist. And down below that X, he writes, "The light has gone out of my life." That's all they wrote. He resigns his position in the New York Assembly, where he's arguably going to be the next governor. He's the most prominent young politician. He gives up his child, Alice, to his sister, says, you raise her. By the way, eventually she became somewhat of a wild child and was a sort of early celebrity, sort of Paris Hilton without the airhead part. And Roosevelt once said about her, I can be president of the United States or I can be a father to Alice, but I can't possibly be both. And he moves west. He goes to the Dakota Territory and he takes up residence in this little 400-square-foot ranch house, and he hangs his bearskin rug, one on the wall, puts one on the floor, has his books there, and he's a cattleman. He's a bespectacled cattleman. And in that 2 years or so, nearly 2 years' time where he's in the Dakotas, he says, the West makes him whole. The West saves him. He becomes a man again. He becomes a whole person. His heart is healed. And he says later, I owe more to the West than any man alive. But without the West, I never could have been a person who came back to life. And he also has this conservation epiphany. Well, he doesn't call it that. That's what we writers call it. He thinks the West is Eden. or that's his preconception. But in fact, it's pretty desiccated by the time he gets out there in the 1880s. The bison are gone. The birds are nearly gone. Everything that made, the Indians have all been pushed off to the margins. Everything that had been written about, just 50 years earlier as being great, prolific amounts of, were gone. He goes on a sad buffalo hunt, can't find buffalo. So he sees that in a very short amount of time, man has screwed it up. That Americans straddling this continent, not even 100 years that we'd straddled it in his time, have almost drained the thing, almost gutted it, almost ruined it. So he has this sort of feeling. So that's where he gets it. It goes back to what happened with his wife and his mother and what happened to him in the Dakotas. Now, fast forward, he's president. He's an accidental president because McKinley is assassinated. Roosevelt is the vice president. He's sworn in, he's our youngest president. And he hires Pinchot, who he'd met earlier. I had a scene in the book where they're doing very manly things before they got into the skinny dipping. They're wrestling with their underpants. I know there's some homoerotic themes here, but we're very manly men, as they said later. But Roosevelt actually had this wrestling mat installed in the governor's mansion. He did come back and become governor of New York, before he became vice president. But he had this wrestling mat, which he expensed to the state because he said, some people hold state dinners, I like to wrestle with my guests. So he and Pinchot wrestling, they share the same thought. Pinchot is a son of privilege. His grandfather had come here from France and had clear-cut much of the state of Pennsylvania and then decided to build a school of forestry. So, as these things often happen in American history, the first school of forestry in Yale. So they start the Forest Service. And they call it the Great Crusade. And they hire these people. They want them almost all to be Yaleys. They have to come through the Yale School of Forestry. Except they realize there's this huge culture clash. They send these Yale-trained, elites out who are all fused with the Great Crusade, and they come out, and it's like Deadwood in the West. There's booming, brawling, whoring, saloooning, every manner of raw America going on in these newly designated national forests. And so they go to these towns, like one is named Taft for the unfortunate president. And there's this great story. I thought it was only Forest Service lore until I actually confirmed it. And I'll tell you how I confirmed it. But two of these Yaleys, these young GPs, these fresh 20-something rangers are in the Lolo National Forest on the Montana border. And they go outside of this town and they're shocked. And, this is the town, Taft, that one reporter said had the highest murder rate in the United States, that would find these bodies when the snow would melt in the spring. It was just a brawling, open town. So these two forest rangers are there, and they've been there a day or so, and they notice this house of prostitution going up, and they're shocked. And they send a cable down to Missoula that says, make sure I get this right, 2 undesirable prostitutes established on government land. What should I do? And some smart ass gets a hold of the cable in Missoula and writes back, get 2 desirable ones. They told this story, I heard the story in the Forest Service of lore, and I was reading for this book 2.5 years ago while I was touring, and this woman came up to me in California where I was reading, and she takes this thing out of her purse, and it's this plastic encased yellowed telegram, and it says, get 2 desirable ones. She goes, that was my grandfather. And she has the telegram. It's unbelievable. I go, wow, so it's true, too. It had the added value, as Henry Kissinger said, of being true. So, now, while this culture clash is going on in the woods, the Forest Service is just a few years old. It's established in 1905. Pinchot's getting a little full of himself. Roosevelt finally gives him, reign over these public lands. And in order to sell it to a reluctant Congress, he says that we can control wildfire. Congress sort of doesn't see what Pinchot and Roosevelt see. They don't see a need for a Forest Service. And so they say, they sort of sell it as we'll be able to control fire. So he sends, Pinchot writes just a few weeks before the big burn. In the early days, it was assumed that fires were considered simply and solely acts of God, against which any opposition was hopeless and futile. It was assumed it was the natural order of things. Today, we understand that fires are totally within the control of man. And again, it's nature bats last. They were almost inviting. It was very similar to something I found in Dust Bowl research where at the start of the 20th century, the U.S. Department of Agriculture put out a statement that said, "The soil is the one immutable resource that can never be destroyed." So then, of course, the fire happened. Roosevelt leaves office in 1909, and Taft takes over. Now, I was kind of happy to see the little Chris Christie boom recently, because it brought people to talk about Taft, one of our most obscure presidents. Now, Taft was our heaviest president. He was 350 pounds and very insecure. He felt that Roosevelt had overshadowed him so much, although Roosevelt selected him. He was just, to follow him, to be his successor, and then he was elected and supported him. But later, Roosevelt went against him. But if you want an idea of how people would have treated Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, had he got in the race, you only need to look at how the press treated Taft. His nickname, when he was shot from behind, was Aft Taft. And he supposedly broke a bathtub once. And he did break a horse once. A horse fell while he was on it, and Roosevelt advised him never to ride a horse in public. He said, "You can ride a horse, just don't do it in public." Taft had a very rough time with it. He was not interested in the Forest Service. It's his first year in office. He just didn't have the passion for it. So Roosevelt goes off to Africa for a year. He's out of here. Pinchot is trying to hold the Forest Service together. Taft doesn't care. Congress is tearing it apart. There are all these, you should have good enemies in a public policy battle. They had terrific enemies. There were two senators from the West, one from Montana named Clark, one from Idaho named Hayburn. And Clark was this absolutely corrupt bastard. I mean, there's no other way to put it. Because, I'm trying to think, Mark Twain said he was the most disgusting creature the Republic has ever produced. And that's, a good insult, and you have to go some ways to earn that saying. What he did was he bought a Senate seat. We used to not elect senators by direct election. Some people want to go back to that. It's called the 17th Amendment. We now elect our senators. But we didn't used to. They used to be appointed by the state legislators. And Clark bought his seat. And he was open about it. He gave out envelopes with his name monogrammed on the envelope with $10,000. That was the going rate for a vote. He bought his Senate seat from Montana, moved to New York, built this fabulous limestone mansion on Fifth Avenue, and never moved back to Montana. And his sole desire during his one term as U.S. Senator was to destroy the Forest Service. And he said, he was asked about, well, shouldn't we do something for future generations? That's what conservation is all about. Look what we're doing. We're being greedy. We're being rapacious. And he said, "Those who succeed us can well take care of themselves." So now, it's fascinating little irony of history. Clark later went on after he was one term in the Senate and was one of the early founders of Las Vegas. And Clark County, Nevada, is named for him. And I was thinking when I was down there once, looking at the Clark County Justice Center, what an oxymoron it is to have this guy who's totally corrupt, greedy bastard, bought his way to the Senate now. So Clark, who was Clark? Oh, some venerable guy. So that was one of the enemies. And they were set to kill the Forest Service. They had defunded it. They had nickel and dimed it to death. These young GPs are out in the woods. They're having this culture clash because the people don't want them. The people who live in the woods don't want them. And then the senators who represent these states don't want them. And it looks like this great experiment that Pinchot and Roosevelt have given us is going to die almost in vitro. 5 years old, 1910, Forest Service is 5 years old. Then what happens? The woods blow up. So you have, and this is what's so fascinating about these little accidents of history. Something can happen and turn everything. I mean, imagine if Roosevelt wasn't president, we do all that. But imagine if we hadn't had this fire. It was a warm summer. All summer, no rain. April, May, June, July, just forests just tinder dry. This is in the panhandle of Idaho and western Montana, and so these lightning fires start, and the woods start to pop, and there's all these little fires, and they assemble all these people because they're afraid of this big thing, and then on August 20th, 1910, a term that I'd heard when I was a kid, but I didn't really know what it meant, called the Palouse, originating in the Palouse country of eastern Washington, blows into where these little fires are going. And it just becomes this horrific wind. It bounces off these walls and the Clearwater drainage and the Bitterroot drainage, And this thing, these 3,000 little fires become one fire. So this thing just goes boom, 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 until it's feeding on itself. And it's going along, it's destroying towns, it's plucking along the ridge, and its crowns are burning, zipping across. And all these people are assembled, and they're helpless. They're absolutely helpless. So in the town of Wallace, you had this evacuation. One train going to Missoula, one train going to Spokane, and saying, it's like the scene from the Titanic. Women and children only, everyone else has to stay and fight or die. And the National Guard has been, martial law has been declared. There are these African-American soldiers, these Buffalo soldiers, who are put fixed bayonets on because the men refuse to obey the orders of the mayor. They want to get on the train, they push people off, and so it's utter chaos. And in the middle of all this, you get a message that comes down from one of the forest rangers, one of the supervisors in Wallace, and he says, all crews hopelessly lost. So it looks like this conflagration is going to not only destroy 3 million acres, but thousands and thousands of people. Well, the thing blows over, and it actually does snow about 4 days later. It starts to snow. But the net effect is we've lost about 100 men, and there are these people who have horrible injuries, these young rangers and these immigrants. Some of them did die just by diving into little ditches, or they got pinned by trees that were falling. Many of them dove into creeks and just, that was the only safe place you could be. Some of them went into mine shafts thinking that I'll be safe from a fire there, and they died of CO2 poisoning because the oxygen was all sucked out. This fire is just like a beast when it's like that. It's in search of oxygen. It just moves along. So, but it had the net effect of making heroes and martyrs out of these people. So suddenly, public perception changes. That these are young men who died for the Great Crusade. These are people who gave it up for something bigger than themselves, for the Roosevelt cause of public land. And public sentiment shifts. So the Congress comes back, and they not only, restore the Forest Service budget, but they pass this law allowing there to be national forests in the East. And so when I was reading for this book in the East Coast, I said to people in Pennsylvania and Maine and all up and down the East Coast that you owe your national forests, those great, wonderful hardwoods that are turning colors right now, to a fire out west 100 years ago. This law would have never been passed had public sentiment not shifted because of the big burn. It also had a strange effect. Thereafter, the Forest Service became the Fire Service. And they tried to put out every fire, just like Pinchot said. So Norman MacLean, a wonderful writer who wrote Young Men and Fire, not just A River Runs Through It, but he died before he could finish Young Men and Fire, which is a beautiful book largely about death and coming to terms with mortality. And MacLean was in his 80s when he finished it. Actually, he didn't finish it, his son finished it for him, but he was trying to come to grips with this fire. And he said that the Forest Service had 1910 on the brain, that they tried to put out your fire. And there was an edict that went out that said if you were a ranger and you had a fire in your district, that sucker had to be put out by 10 o'clock the next morning. It's called the 10 o'clock rule. So they tried to snuff every fire. They tried to stop nature. And we see some of that today. We have all this fuel that's built up all over the West. Now, a side thing I should mention is that I was down in the Tetons a couple weeks ago, and I flew over a big swath of the central parts of the Rockies I hadn't seen for a while, and it was just this huge ghost forest. There are 40 million acres in the West that are dead or dying now because of beetle infestation. And you see these standing, rusted, dead trees because the beetles just stop the sap from coming up and the trees die standing still, essentially. And I fear we'll have a giant conflagration of some sort with all this standing dead timber, but they think the current ghost forest is because of climate change. That the Forest Service models are that because western temperatures have changed just a degree or two have been enough for these beetles to metastasize and winter over, whereas severe winters used to kill them. And they've done a number of studies on this. So you're seeing this effect, again, sort of humans changing the land. It's not a direct result of the don't burn policy. Now, what do we learn from all of this? I try to be optimistic. I try to think that human nature does learn from these events. But then, I look at the many bubbles, going back to the tulip bubble, and the Dust Bowl started out as a commodities bubble because the price of wheat doubled, then it tripled, then it quadrupled. So he plowed up all this land thinking, oh, wheat's always going to go up. And then it crashed down to a dime a bushel, where it was up to $4 a bushel, which is not far from what it was selling for a few years ago. So you see these repetitive things, like these bubbles repeat themselves. I don't know if we learn. I don't know if we ever become humble in the face of nature. I don't know if we realize that nature does back last. I wish I could tell you, yeah, we've learned great lessons and we'll never do that again. But I'd be lying to you. But I do want to close and saying one word about a hero of that fire, Ed Pulaski. And he was not a little GP. He was not from Yale. He was a divorced, middle-aged man who had a 6th grade education. He was not from that famous Pulaski family of the Revolutionary War. People always mistook him for that Pulaski, and he would, after a while, just take credit for it. But he had no relationship to those Pulaskis. He kicked around the West doing a lot of odd jobs until he got hired by the Forest Service. And they made him a ranger because he got along with people. And he talked like the folks. And he could do a million things. He was a jack of all trades. On the eve of the Big Burn, he goes to see his wife in Wallace. And his adopted daughter, Elsie, was 10 years old. And his wife says, you've got to flee with us. The trains are getting ready to go out of town. She goes, we've got to get out. I may never see you again. And he looks at his family and he says, but I've got a crew up in the hill. I can't leave these guys up there. And she goes, no, you have to come. We'll never see each other again. Well, he makes the decision to go back with his crew. So he kisses his wife goodbye and his daughter. He goes back up, flames that blow up his star, and you can see up on the ridge, just above Wallace. The thing is scotched along the ridge there. And Pulaski goes back up there, and he finds utter panic. People are fleeing. Men are crying for their mothers. Horses are crapping. They're whinnying. It's a total scene from Dante's Inferno. The thing is just blowing up and people are running pell-mell. And Pulaski organizes them. And he says, if you follow me, if you stay with me, maybe we can live. And at one point, actually 2 points, forest rangers used to carry guns. He pulls his sidearm out and he orders them, the force of his gun, to follow him. And they go into this mine shaft and they go deep into this mine shaft. There's a puddle about 6 inches deep there. And, one of the horses dies in the mine shaft. 2 of the men die in the mine shaft. But most of them live. And the next day they get up, and with their burned shoes and their feet all swollen and their hair singed and the forest still sort of just smoking, they make their way down to Wallace. And they're hailed as heroes. They're treated, but they're in terrible shape. Pulaski's lung is hugely compromised. He loses his vision in one eye. They have no medical care. The Forest Service can't take care of them. They don't have medical care. They pass the hat around for them. And then they kick him out of the hospital. They go on their way. So Pulaski spends the next 20 years of his life a very bitter man. And he wants these people to be remembered. He mows the grass of the graves outside of Wallace of some of the people who have fallen. He goes up in the mountains to where others have fallen and makes sure there's some marker there. But every year he sends a letter to Congress, can we just get a couple $100 to memorialize these people who died in the Big Burn? And he gets nothing. Well, he dies a bitter man. And I'm happy to report that last summer, on August 20th, on the 100th anniversary of this fire, I was in Wallace, Idaho. And there were Buffalo soldiers, those African-American troops from descendants of earlier Buffalo soldiers, but there still are them, who were there. There were descendants of some of the immigrants who had fought in this fire. There were smoke jumpers who flew overhead, and some of them parachuted out. It was a wonderful feeling of all parts of the Forest Service family coming together. And they unveiled this Ed Pulaski National Historic Site. And they have a memorial to him, not just to him, and not just to the people who died. They're all in one burial area now, but you can walk the trail, as I did, up to the mine shaft. And along the way at certain stations of the cross, you can see where Pulaski did certain things, and it's part of our shared story now. So at least he was remembered. Thank you.